anybody there?
Yeah, hello.
Hey, good morning or afternoon.
Hi, Jaime. How are you? Thanks for having me on.
Oh, I'm great. Thank you so much for taking the time to do this. I'm really thrilled to get to chat about your latest work, which is Tell Me What You See. It's a pretty awesome collection of work that I had the pleasure of reading this week. So
Thank you.
before we get the ball rolling on this one, though, I want to make sure that we talk a little bit about where you come from, because if I'm not mistaken, you're from Kentucky, right? But transplanted to New York?
Correct. Yes. I'm originally from Sinking Fork, Kentucky, which is a community in the rural western part of the state, so small that the way my grandfather talked, they took the post office away when he was young, but they actually took it away when his father was young. So that's where I'm originally from. And then I've lived in Manhattan for about 8 years now. And
Mm.
I've also lived in Washington, D.C. and a couple of spots in France.
Oh, wonderful. So can
Yeah.
we take a moment to dwell on Kentucky for a little bit? I was raised in a small town in Wyoming, Mexican guy in the West. So it's something that is very dear to my heart. How do you feel like you found your footing there, if you ever did, in Kentucky? Was there a good feeling of home there, or was it a place that you wanted to escape or get away from?
Is it possible to say both?
Yes, that's my
And
favorite answer.
yeah, and I would have said like it's funny, like 'cause there are a lot of questions in there, and it's like I'm on a business trip, so there's part of me. I'm right now. I'm speaking to you from the Hilton. So if we hear any odd sounds, they're not me. They're not in my home. They're a neighbor here at the Hilton Columbus. Where I am for work. So I wanted to say, let's unpack this because, I'm in this business speak, but please do not ever let me say anything like that on an arts podcast. But if we were to go back and break down the multiple questions that you asked, about like finding my grounding and finding my feet, my mother would have told you that I was born fully fledged like Athena, so like I found those immediately. And it's funny, like we don't even think about having to find our feet with where we're originally from because that's just where we're automatically planted. It's like a
Hmm.
plant coming up from the ground. It doesn't have to find its roots. The roots and the seed were there first.
Hmm.
So part of me will always be Kentucky, but you're right to where there's very much this balance. And there's a lady named Dr. Shay Parton out of Purdue University who has started a rural young adult movement. And she uses the term rural out migrant for people who are very much from and of the rural environment where they grew up, but they've left. And so there's part of me, like being here, I'm in Columbus for work, and this hotel is next to a mall, and the mall is sprawling. And people are saying, excuse me, when they're not anywhere near me. And in New York City, if someone you don't know speaks to you, they're crazy. And so I'm looking at these people like, why are you talking to me? Like, is this person crazy and going to attack me? And then they're looking at me like, are you crazy? Why are you looking at me like that? And, and there are differences from Kentucky to Ohio, but I called my mom and I was like, Mom, there's so much space. I'm freaking out. And my mom just breathe. And she's like, I know that Ohio isn't home, but when you come home, you adapt to all the space just fine. You adapt to complete strangers telling you in the grocery, you shouldn't get that. That cereal is horrible, and it's because that's the culture that I'm from. So it's funny as to when I'm a Kentuckian and when I'm a New Yorker. And that is one of the themes that I think does very much pop out in the book. So I'm glad that you were able to pick up. Makes me feel good as a writer that you as a reader were able to pick up on that. So
Yeah,
thank
yeah.
you.
And there's so many amazing threads in this collection because I
Thank you.
was I was sitting there wrapping it up a couple of days ago, and just this general idea of distance, which is one that I'm obsessed with, and especially the pieces that dabbled in the pandemic and that were set in that situation. I can't imagine being in New York at the real core of what we experienced, a couple of years ago, that I think you captured it very. I mean, I wasn't there, I can just say, from what I read and what I saw on the internet,
Yeah.
you captured it so strongly and it was so vivid, especially some of the devices that you used. And I think this might be a good time to just dive in because I feel like I got a lot, to talk about in terms of the
Thank
book.
you.
But let's talk about Tell Me What You See. And if we could set the stage a little bit, and maybe you could tell me a bit about how this comes out in terms of a manuscript and how you
Yeah.
arrive at these pieces and being what they were as a manuscript.
Yeah, it's funny. It's you get that question a lot, and it makes sense because we're looking at an experimental collection that has so many different forms in it. Like one story that I think may be the one you're talking about on contrasting Kentucky and New York, the entire story takes place on the main character's phone. So like there are texts and there
Mm-hmm.
are memes or memes, depending on how you say it, an emoji and stuff like that. And so it's a very natural question to ask, but I've never found a way to answer it without spoiling one of the stories. Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
but basically, well, there are 10 stories in it, so I won't tell you which one, and maybe that will help us keep from having spoilers. And then also, I mean, it's the answer, so it's out there in the universe. But there is a story in there about the attack on the U.S. Capitol, January 6th. And I have a very, very, very good friend who is a member of Congress.
Mm.
And I thought I saw her cowering on the floor at that moment in time where you saw them having to barricade the house doors
Mm.
and the men were trying to get through with the guns. And then the camera passes and I thought I saw her laying by where she usually sits on the floor.
Oh, goodness.
And it just, like as an American, that was a harrowing day.
Yeah.
But as somebody whose friend was in that building, and it's funny because then when they were evacuating them, my mom thought that she saw her.
Oh.
Her then fiance thought that she saw her. Now she wasn't there. She was safe in the Raymond building. But, it's like we had all of these people who were in her life who thought that they saw her. And that made me angry on a much, much higher level.
Mm-hmm.
And as an American, that's a day I don't think we can let go until full justice is served. And,
Mm-hmm.
I believe that justice is gradually being served through different arrests and indictments and things like that.
Yeah.
But as a friend, I just stayed at this very heightened level of anger.
Mm-hmm.
And I had to write about this. And it wasn't the kind of livable anger, I mean, I feign to call it livable, that we'd all been living with for 2 to 3 years.
Mm-hmm.
It was a palpable, every single conversation I had, why are we not talking about this?
Yeah.
Why are we not doing this? And, and it got to where people in my life were like, we're upset too. We just want to know where you want to go eat tonight. But it was one of those things, Jaime, where I had to write about it. And that was the only way that I was not going to blow up.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
physically. And I also knew, though, that it could not, there's no Freytag pyramid about that day. There's no, and then Haley goes to work and she's bright and she's young and she's chipper and, she wants to help America. And then we've got a narrative hook. There are men with guns. Ooh, interesting. I'm hooked. Rising, they enter the Capitol.
Yeah.
You just can't write about crazy things in a non-crazy manner. And so I started thinking, how do I write that story? How do I write? And I knew it needed to be fiction, but it was like, how do I write about January 6th? And I was like, well, it's got to be experimental. It's got to be something like not just away from like a lot of Flash does not follow Freytag, but those are still traditional forms.
Yeah.
And I was like, it's got to be something brand new because that day was brand new. It's got to be something the way that the story is actually put together structurally starts to instill that fear and that horror of the day. Not necessarily horror as a genre, but you get what I'm saying.
Yeah, yeah. And if I may add there, and this is something that was pervasive through the whole piece, I thought that you did a phenomenal job of creating this sense of tension that
Thank
was
you.
just constantly building through various forms, various genres. I think that's something that was very unique to this. But to your point about writing about something that is so charged, that is so difficult to talk about, that may seem structureless to some degree, which is honestly, even to this day, you look at what happened and you're like, how?
Right.
How could this go from point A to point B to point C? And the way that you wrote it, and I'm not going to spoil anything, I hope, is to find a visual parallel and to find a situation that sort of mimics that kind of thing on a personal level, which I thought was very, very clever. And I'm going to leave it right there because I don't want to
Yeah.
I don't want to dabble.
Exactly. It's one of those stories you desperately want to talk
Yeah,
about it, but it's
yeah,
kind of like, I don't know, when I was in the ninth grade, we did Romeo and Juliet. And by the ninth grade, like most people usually haven't read it yet, but you know the drill.
yeah.
And it's funny because we'd read like the first act and we were discussing it in class. And then the teacher goes, this really makes sense when you think about the fact that they die at the end. And this girl in the corner went, they die at the end? And it's like, and everybody turned around and we were like, how did she not know that? But none of us had read it ever. And it's like, it's like you don't want to take away the joy of, well, I mean, I was about to say, or just the joy of the reading experience of that one person in the world who didn't know yet that they
Yeah.
die at the end.
Yeah.
Like the shock of like seeing Juliet rise up. But it's funny because I had never really written experimental before, or I'd never thought about it that way. I'd had an unpublished stream of consciousness novel, which some people called experimental, but I'm like, Catherine Ann Porter existed, so it's not experimental, because it's not an experiment. I'm not doing anything new.
Yeah.
But I'd never written it before, and I knew that if I just started with that, it wouldn't work. It wouldn't be good because the capital was huge. Like you were talking about, like even as a nonfiction narrative, it didn't even make, like they stopped halfway through the day and went and ate tacos.
This is so really bizarre. Yeah.
It's like, well, we're going to storm the Capitol, then we're going to eat tacos, then we're going to kill a Capitol guard. Like
it's on the planner. Didn't you get the agenda? It's
yeah, exactly. It's like, and now we're learning that there actually was an agenda. Like it's just crazy. It's like storm the Capitol, go to Chipotle. Like it's just, I don't know. But anyway, it may not have been Chipotle. So if you're listening at home, please don't boycott Chipotle because of my statement.
Yeah.
But but so I started with like other things, and I was like, well, what else is crazy? What else can't be told straight? And so that's how like, the COVID about the Kentucky versus New York, living during COVID on the character's phone that we were talking about earlier. Like I did a choose your own COVID adventure that did not make it in the collection, where no matter what choice you made, you died. It came across as a little flippant to be so soon.
Yeah. And I think there was also a wonderful balance here of taking something that feels so impersonal, so separated, removed from the humane point of view, which I think now we are desensitized from a lot of these things. And one of the things that works really well in this collection is how human, how first person everything feels, especially in the context of these massive things that we could very easily push away and dismiss and say, no, this doesn't apply to me because I'm not in New York or I'm not here or there. A lot of these larger issues become personal. And I thought that was just such an elegant way to deliver that, and something that I'm obsessed with because I know that we have to talk about these things, but I don't want a stump speech every single piece of fiction that I read. Like I want something that can reel me in some way through an emotional component and then really give us what it is. And I wanted to ask you, this is sort of like a long-winded question here, but you have a background in journalism or writing. Is that right?
It's more of a middle ground, but
okay.
It's funny because every now and again, like I'll talk to a friend from college who I haven't talked to in 2 or 3 years, and she's like, "So what are you doing for a living now?" Like I've just always kind of changed my job. I think the longest that I've been in any single occupation is 10 years. But I owned a translation company at one point. I owned a machine learning, which now everybody's calling AI, but there is a difference, a visual recognition company that I started at one point. So I've done everything, but I've always been a writer. So I was a freelance reporter with Washington Post, The Guardian, places like that for about maybe 2.5, 3 years in there. And then I've always, with my other roles, I've always just kind of written, like business articles and stuff. So
okay. I was gonna I was gonna try to ask you about that because one of the things that I loved about some of the stories in here was how there was a sense of, I want to say there was a grounding in a kind of research, perhaps. There was a rigor there that paired with a human part of it, of the characters, you felt like there was a real groundedness to even like the fictions or the far-flung things that you were writing about. I felt grounded in a kind of research. And I'm curious if you felt that way, especially when you were writing some of the almost sci-fi pieces that you have in here. Like,
Yeah.
if you could explain that relationship of those two elements.
Well, it's funny. It's because you made a comment earlier about it feeling first person. And like those two compliments together have just made this like my favorite interview either. But one of the biggest, like, like when, like I still send short stories to journals. And, when you do get that personal rejection that has like a one sentence as to why we did not like this.
Yeah.
I don't mean the journals that are obviously leading people on that say, resubmit to everybody. And then it's obvious, like the fifth time you submit, you're like, oh, their format is rejection paragraph, one line compliment. Thank you, so-and-so.
Yeah.
I don't mean those, but like when you do get like some of the rejections that I get back are saying that it feels too journalistic. But to me, I'm not able to write in first person. And part of that, there is a first person flash piece in here that everybody kept, like I kept getting rejections on it from journals saying, this is a lovely essay. And I'm like, it's short fiction. That's why I sent it to you. And it's in first person. So part of why I don't do first person is because people think it's about me. And like with that particular story that's in the book, she spends like 3 weeks in the bathtub without getting out. And I'm like, so if that were about me, I'd be dead and unable to submit this. But another part is that it's really, I won't say it's really hard for me emotionally, but we live in such an emotionally strong time that I personally am on overload. And so third person removedness, and you hear people make this argument that you can't get close enough to the character with third. But when you just said that it feels like first person, that tells me, yes, you can.
Yes.
Like in the story you're talking about when you're asking about research, someone that popped in my mind, it's called Privacy Station. And it is about two scientists who pretty much orbit the year as part of a reality TV show, trying to basically bring back plant life and food to a world that has pretty much depleted it with climate change and other matters. And it's in third person, but you think about like what it depicts of those characters' lives. It's one of the more intimate. I think it's probably the most intimate story in there. Yeah. So you're saying that it's like you can, like to me, I don't know, like when you get some of that first person, it's like so, almost like Marcel Proust and Everybody's Thoughts. That to me almost pulls me out as a reader because I shut off because I'm like it's like the reason I'm not on Instagram. I don't care what you ate last night. I'm sorry, like eat your own food. Like I don't, it's just I've got enough known, I don't need to know like that menial level, but part of the way that I write, and I don't think of it as intentionally creating removedness, but you have to have a distance sometimes to feel close because it's inside that distance that the reader is able to start applying to their own life and to start creating and constructing their own vision of what the setting, like in that case, like what the space station looks like. Like I say that there's a tub, I say that there's a table, I say that there are dishes, but what color they are is up to you, And so, but you have readers who they get pulled out. So I do research stuff. And it's funny that you mentioned it. I do that a lot more after being a journalist than I did before. And it's because people get pulled out, like say they're botanists and say you are a botanist and you're like, oh my gosh, you would never use, the whatever scissors for that. Like my mom is one of those readers, like where she'll pull out and, and they do it with movies and that kind of thing. And so I always kind of research those details to make sure that they're right so that you don't want that where you lose a reader. And then also I learn a lot about the characters that way. Because I'm having to get to know these people before I write them. And I don't mean in the Twitter, what's your character's favorite color ice cream, #writing community way. I mean in the way that like I'm even getting to know you through this call and the way that listeners are getting to know both of us. And, and to me, if their job is a prominent part of the story, I need to kind of understand what they do for a living, like you would a
Yeah,
friend,
yeah.
in order to write them.
Yeah, and
So,
I do think that just to your point, there was a moment with Aaron, one of the characters
yeah,
in
I
that
love
piece. Lovely. They, I'm trying to find a way to phrase it because I really appreciated that there was a kind of devotion that could be found in the person's work
yeah.
that you wrote about, and I think that you could only arrive at that kind of character conclusion if you went in and investigated and went down that rabbit hole of botany to understand this might be something that a person might find in that profession, but at the surface level you can't really uncover that sort of work. So how do you go from finding the right amount of research versus like burying yourself in something that will send you down a rabbit hole that won't help anything and will just delay you?
I think part of it is the way that my mind works. I have, and I don't mean that I have attention deficit hyperactivity in the way that a lot of people just go, "Oh, I'm so ADD." Like I'm clinically diagnosed with it, Jaime.
Hmm.
I was 15. I probably should have been diagnosed at 3 if they
Hmm.
were doing that for girls then.
Yeah.
I'm textbook, and so I cannot. I can rabbit hole on stuff. Like I will hyper focus while writing, but I hyper focus more on a certain character and thinking a story in the book called Fifth Fear,
Hmm.
where the rhythms are very different. And it's like, like 3 hours is one day is 3 hours, or blah, 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 blah. And like I start thinking like that. So I do rabbit hole that way. But like on the research, it's more research and write, research and write, research
Okay.
and write opposed to like a historical fiction novelist who might, I don't know, my friend Tiffany Rice, she's a romance and erotica novelist, but she's got a historical romance. She went and spent like 3 weeks living in a lighthouse because her
Oh wow.
character is in time in a lighthouse. Like that's not me. That's not, like for this privacy station story, I went to the library. I got a book about plants and I just started flipping through it and looking at interesting phrases. And then
Mm.
at some point I Googled how, because there's like a paragraph where it talks about on Earth, because of gravity, plants grow from underneath the ground, up through the ground, and then up toward the sky. But in space, like a plant, like, I don't know, like, say the branch of something, it circumnavigates itself because the gravity points are all different.
Yeah.
So, like, I did Google, how do plants grow in space? But I probably didn't even spend an hour on it because the minute I saw that fact, I was like, oh, that's it.
Yeah.
And then my little ADHD self was back on the horse track and running. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah. And I
So I
think
don't neurotypical. I have no idea on earth how you would do
right,
it.
right. But it really lends itself to being a proper, sorry, I was going to say like a seed for a story, and I'm going to be punning left and right. But I do think like the beauty of that story is that you did manage to find the balance, and I think there was a degree of trust where you gave it enough space that people needed to fill in the blanks in a really satisfying way because it's dense. There's a lot to kind of take in, but that was one of my favorite pieces, and I think that you did that research component very 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 well. If we could go to the beginning, one of the first pieces that you mentioned, which was the portal story, and I believe that one was, yeah, the Fifth Fear. I really appreciated sort of the way that you navigated this time dilation. And I thought it was a wonderful, parallel to other things. And I don't want to say more to kind of not give away anything, but can we use that as an example to talk about how a story came to be from beginning to what you felt was a successful draft?
Yeah, that was actually a dream that I had. And
Oh,
it's
okay.
funny because we're coming from talking about Privacy Station. Privacy Station, the story about them orbiting space, that was also a dream. And they're two markedly different. Like Privacy Station, when I dreamt it, it actually had like a narrative plot line.
Mm,
Sort of it was more like watching a movie in my dream. And then the Fifth Fear, it's more like how Salvador Dali dreamt his paintings.
yeah.
Like it just makes sense. It's a bunch of stuff kind of slopped together. But I dreamt about what that story. I hate to say what that story is about because this really isn't. It's about this as much as Gone with the Wind is about the Civil War or Sex and the City is about
Yeah.
But which if you've never seen that movie or that show, they're not about the Civil War and sex, obviously. But that story, there's a portal in it. I won't say it's about a portal, but there's kind of like a Stargate kind of portal that is in New York down where the river kind of hits the city. And that's what I dreamt about. And I dreamt about like the stairs and the people going in and out of it. And, it's like all the shadow and darkness and that sort of thing. And when I woke up, I thought, well, I turned the other thing to a story. Maybe I can do that with this. But the form actually came from research. Like I knew that it was about fear because that was the emotion in the dream. And I knew that I wanted this big thing like on Stargate, and much cooler movie than TV show, by the way.
Yeah.
But yeah. But anyway, I started looking up just different things about fear and psychology. And I found out about this kid named Douglas Marie that basically was used as a baby in psychological studies. And they took him from his mom at birth and told the mom he was dead
Oh God.
because like the mom was poor, and they may have even been like a minority or something, but there was some sort of circumstances, like the mom may have been indigent. I don't remember. I don't always retain a lot of the research, which I think helps me keep focused at the time because I don't exactly apply it or I keep going. But then I found that there actually is a theory that is called the 5 fears, and that all fears basically can be described down to 1. Down to 5. And I actually knew a gentleman who was a psychologist in my 20s who told me once that we only had 1 fear, and that all other fears grew from it. Like if your fear is a fear of being hurt, then maybe you gradually become afraid of snakes, or maybe you gradually become afraid of heights, but your fear is actually of being hurt. And so I was going out looking for that, and I found the theory. I believe that Carl Albrecht is the psychologist's name. And I was supposed to say, you can check it in the story. But it's like the story is correct. That's fiction. But he broke it down into 5. And when I saw those, I was like, that makes sense with my dream. And, and then I was looking at everything that we all went through in Corona, like the final fear in the psychological 5th fear, not the story, but in the real life Albrechtian 5 fears, the final one is extinction. And I was like, well, if you look at everything that we're afraid of at Corona, like one of them is ego or loss of self. Like people, like people who didn't want to wear masks, some of them were horrible people. Not all of them were horrible people. Some of them just quite literally didn't want a government telling them what to do, which, being from Kentucky, I can fully understand, And with those folks, like that connects to ego or loss of self. Like they were afraid that they would lose their independent rights in the face of what they believed to be unilateral government. Now the ones that went and got tacos later, we'll just completely forget about. But, but when you looked at everything that we were afraid of at Corona, you're really not going to find anybody who they were really just afraid of the disease. They were afraid of dying. They were afraid of losing their loved ones. They were afraid of a government imposing them. They were afraid of not having power and control over what was going on in their lives.
Yeah.
I'm one of those people. I don't have to have power and control, but I have to know who has it. And I have to know that it's going down. Like I don't need it personally, but when I don't know what's going on, that's when I flip. So that's when I just wound up taking it, and I just kind of structured around it. And then I wrote from those 5 fears, trying to figure out what goes into what pockets.
Yeah. And it's such a beautiful piece. It's one of my favorites because of that.
Yeah.
Again, just this idea that you can find structures around research, and then you can start to add the human element to it, and then you got something that really resonates because it's grounded in something. But I'm reminded of, I don't want to say it's a gift. It's probably a curse. I don't know, but the restlessness of a mind like yours, and how it seems like you found a way to use it to your benefit. Is that something creatively that you feel is accurate?
Yeah. And I'm glad to hear that you think it's to my benefit. I'm a little bit worried as a writer about career building because like I've got a novel that's or a novella that's coming out with First Bite Press next year that's actually erotica.
Mm,
And then like I've got my stream of consciousness novel that I'm trying to get out there that some people have called a literary thriller. So then the part of me that has owned two businesses, it's like at some point you should build a brand,
mm,
but I can't write the same thing twice.
yeah.
It's just not how I'm made.
Uh-huh.
And you see that in this collection, like, like the Privacy Station, we were talking about outer space, it's slow. It's something more that you would read like in Plowshares, or maybe even N+1,
Mm-hmm.
whereas the Fifth Fear, that should have been in Diagram, or somewhere like that. And you don't think Diagram and Plowshares being the same sort of people,
Right, right. I don't know. Maybe I can just empathize with that because, I feel like it liberates you from thinking about genre and form the entire
Yeah.
time that you're doing something. And I don't know, maybe I feel like writers restrict themselves a lot because of that need to build a brand, because of the need to create a body of work that speaks to one identity when I maybe, that's a misguided thing. Is that a wrong kind of approach? I don't know.
I think it depends on I was going to say what you want in life, but I think it's more of what you need in life. And this, dear listener, is where we get into the business side of writing.
Mm-hmm.
But to me, I don't need to be rich. We were raised without a whole lot. My father drove a delivery truck for Coca-Cola, and what he made at the end of the day depended on how much he sold off of the back of it.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
he would come home having traded the Coke that was left on the truck with the Frito-Lay man for chips. Like he came home one day with an entire crate full of marshmallow fluff. And like whenever we had to do refreshments at school, like it was our turn, we brought Coca-Cola. And we just didn't. My mom's family were farmers. We just didn't have a lot. And I feign to say we were poor because, my gosh, in rural freaking Kentucky, there were people who were a whole lot of hell more poor than we were.
Mm-hmm.
We were, but for our area was middle class, but nationally was probably just borderline lower middle class.
Yeah.
So I've been poor. I'm not afraid of it. I don't like it, but I know how to do that. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And so when there are a lot of writers who do come from a background of economic privilege. There are a lot of writers who don't. In this industry, the ones who do tend to, reputation-wise and stereotypically, have an easier route to publishing. I don't think anybody's route to publishing is easy, but they do seem to have more family connections to agents and stuff like that. At least those of us who were not raised with money have the belief that those who were have more time to write. Maybe they don't. They've got relatives with cancer and babies to raise and other things going on in their lives too.
Mm-hmm.
But there is the impression that they have more time to write because they're like, when I was in college, I worked 3 jobs at a time, plus taking a course load, but I also found time to write because, I was 18 years old and I could stay up until 3 with cigarettes and like the most highly caffeinated soft drink you've ever had in your life, made in Kentucky. But it's funny because when I look at people who do kind of write the same thing, maybe they're boring people, or maybe they're just making a living. And, that's how you get people to read your second or third book and go back and read the other one. Like I'm the kind of writer that somebody's going to read Tell Me What You See. And if they love experimental, they're probably going to be disappointed when that First Bright Press book comes out. And it's pretty much just about sex, like people who really want erotica, they're going to be like, what do you mean there's only one sex scene and Tell Me What You See? And all it does is just say that he accidentally opened the bathroom door and didn't know she was then it ends. This is so disappointing. I hate this writer. Throw it against the wall. And for me, as long as I have enough to eat and I have a roof over my head and I have clothes on my back that don't have to be newer this season, but they do have to not have holes in them and look embarrassing. As long as I have my daily needs, writing is more important to me than a new pair of shoes. Writing is more important to me than sending my kids to private school and then go to public. I don't have kids, but I'm just trying to think of different examples, that might impact people's lives. We all make decisions. And I'm not saying that if you're not able to write because of economics, that it's not important to you. But, I heard a sermon once where the preacher said that if you've got rocks, pebbles, and sand, the way that you can get all of them into the jug is if you put the rocks in first, and then you put the pebbles in, and then you put the sand, and the smaller items drop in around the big ones.
Mm-hmm.
And then but if you start with the sand, you'll never get in the pebbles or the rocks. And to me, writing is a rock.
Mm.
And so, I live in a tiny studio. Now, I do live in New York. And if writing were more important to me than being in the city and having energy around me, I'd move back to Kentucky, where, what I spend on rent, not in my apartment now, but I just moved a month ago. In the apartment I was in before, I spent the same on rent that friends of mine from high school make a year. So obviously, I'm making personal financial decisions where I would have more time to write. But I'm a book publicist, and I only take on a limited number of clients because I have to protect my writing time.
Yeah.
Do I go out to eat? No. Do I go buy new clothes? No.
Mm-hmm.
And again, I'm not saying everybody has to do that. I don't want somebody to go out there and tweet and go, well, she just says we should all be naked and starving. You're not a real writer because you're not naked and starving.
Yeah.
Please take me out of context here. But you have to decide what in your life is rock. And in as much as you are able, do that first. And so some of these people that they're just writing the same thing over and over, they're making a living.
Yeah.
And to me personally, and I'm not saying that doing that isn't real writing. Again, do not go out and tweet that I say that you have to be naked and hungry and eat, and write the same damn thing every time. But to me, it's more important to write what I want than to go on a vacation, for example.
Mm.
Those are my personal artistic and financial decisions.
Yeah. I want to thank you so much for that honesty, because it really affirms my personal belief on these things, that there's just a huge breadth of what it means to be a writer. But as long as you're comfortable with the choices that you're making, and as long as you're being honest about the kind of life that you want, it doesn't matter whether you're in Kentucky or New York or, over here, wherever the hell I am, in the middle of nowhere. I think it's a matter of accepting the things that you have to work with and proceed. Because I think that, and just, as a quick side note, I felt like I lost a good 10 years of my life waiting for the right circumstances, waiting for things to change, but not really taking it upon myself to improve the situation so that I could flourish as a writer. And so, I now come back to this feeling of you just gotta, I love this visual of the rocks. I think it's something that I'm probably going to be taking a mental note of for a long time moving forward. But if we could just talk about moving to New York and what that's done to, quality of life. I know you kind of addressed that a little bit, but I think that that's a huge cultural shift. And I'm just curious on the change in perspective, because, you hear things about Kentucky, you kind of get a sense that you were kind of a fish out of water. Maybe not, maybe you were just made for the city and ready to go. But how does that inform who you are and what your writing became once you moved?
Well, it's funny. I actually am going home Wednesday back to Kentucky for a week. And, I told my mom a couple of weeks ago, I was like, because I've just finished another story that's really slow, like Privacy Station. And those are very hard for me to write because I'm a very quick person. I think quickly, I act quickly, and then I move on. And, in a lot of my stories, when you read them, you almost feel like the story's on fire. It's like you got to hurry up and read it and you got to drop it.
Yeah.
But those ones that take a lot of time, like the one that I just finished took me right at a year. And, Privacy Station was probably the most difficult personally story I've ever written because it was just so different because it's very, very slow. But when you talk about me being in New York, I told my mom, I was like, I don't know what to write next. And I was like, so I need to come home and get some ideas. So you would think if I need to go home to be kind of around my people, and then learn, what story is inside me to write next and what's important. and wanting to speak for them and that kind of thing. Well, why don't I just live there? But the thing about writing is it's not just pen to paper. It's a lot of self-motivation. It's a lot of self-encouragement and things like that, because like the rejections do come. And when you were offering me so many compliments earlier, I actually thought, man, I wish I could just put him in my pocket and pull him out on the back. And the thing about New York City is there is very much a community of writers there.
Mm.
I've got several friends who they don't all publish. Again, being a writer is not defined by whether you publish or not. It's not defined by whether you quit your day job or not, like we were talking earlier.
Mm-hmm.
But I've got a lot of friends who are writers, and we just go for a walk, and sometimes we talk about how the new grocery store, the people are really rude. And, I wanted arugula as in the salad. And they pointed me to the ruguluk, which is a Jewish pastry. And, silly things like that have to do with living in the city, or like that guy that randomly punched Rick Moranis during the pandemic.
God. Yeah.
Yeah, like you talk about all these things that I'm sure our listeners are either bored or highly entertained by the examples that just have to do with like living there. Like people, like people in other places, like people in Louisville walk along and talk about the Kentucky Derby, or whatever. But then we also talk about writing when needed. Mm-hmm. And it's what a lot of people go to AWP for. It's what a lot of people do in MFA for, which is a mighty expensive way, in my opinion, to have community. But if it works, it works. Mm-hmm. It's what people go on podcasts and listen to podcasts like this for, to form community. And so the thing about it is, it's like I have to be Kentucky to know what to write about and to get my ideas, because I almost always start with character. I don't necessarily start with plot or, setting or anything like that. I start with a person pops up in my mind, and usually a phrase of dialogue coming out of their head, all at the same time. And, so I have to, touch grass if we're going to talk about Twitter memes and stuff again. I have to go home every now and again, touch bluegrass, so to speak. To know what to write about, but to have the energy that it takes to continue writing, I have to be in New York City, or somewhere like that.
I see. But it seems like a yin and yang situation that you kind of flow from one to the other, and you feel comfortable with that sort of perspective. No, that's incredibly inspiring, and I feel like you're affirming the way that I want to go about my writing. So I really appreciate that. No, because I think that like the way that you described your writing makes me feel that I should really go and get that ADHD test. Because you really laid down the way that I've always looked at the creative work, and my inability to sort of wrangle with genre. I want to keep moving, and I want to do things quickly, and I feel like I'm going from point A to point B, and then there's no points at all. But to bring it back to you, I kind of want to wrap up here on the collection, and I'm hoping that you can share a little bit about the message that you want to share with folks in terms of the climate situation and a lot of these big ideas that are just kind of sprinkled within this collection, because I think you do such a wonderful presentation of this. But what is it that we need to take away without giving too much away?
Just read it.
Okay.
I mean, it's hard. Like on the Fifth Fear story, every single critic type person who's read it has said it's about something different. Like one of my beta readers asks me if it was about like having a quarter life crisis at 30 and trying to determine what you wanted to do. And I was just like, no. But it's funny, like if you look at T.S. Eliot's Four Quartets, that's about the war, but every single person who reads it pretty much walks away with something different that it's about. Yeah. And then they would go back to Eliot and be like, no, that's about the war. Yeah. So to me, part of what makes literature good, like if everybody who reads something comes away with the exact same thing, I don't know. I mean, maybe it goes back to like people who write the same thing every time. Like if you give me, like I don't know, like my erotica novella that's coming out, it's called The Life Eaters. It's coming out next year. And pretty much everybody who reads it's going to come away with the same thing, which is it's set in Las Vegas and they have sex. Like some things are pretty standard. But to me, whenever you're going at hard subjects, if everybody comes away with something different, I've done my job. Like the title of the collection is Tell Me What You See. It's not tell me what I saw. It's, I mean, these are the things that I saw as a Kentuckian living in New York the last 3 years. Now you read it and you tell me what you see.
That's amazing. And I can't ask for a better ad for the the collection. I think you did a wonderful job there. And I highly recommend that folks check it out because it really puts into perspective a lot of the things that we were all experiencing, but through a very, as I said, once again, elegant and very clever experimental kind of form. And I maybe would love to talk to you down the road about a bit more of the experimental facet of this, because I think one of my favorite things in hashtag Corona Life, which is another piece that you included in here, was strictly visual and very frenetic, very fast moving, but
Yeah.
it captured something that, again, anticipation that I almost wanted to forget of the state of the pandemic that was really difficult to look at. But you did it in such a way that you made me reprocess those things in a very excellent character driven way. But what I'm getting at is let's leave it there, and I hope that folks check out Tell Me What You See. And last couple of questions here. I'm curious if if there's any content that you're experiencing right now that is inspiring you or lighting that spark again, whether it's books, movies, music, anything that you think is worth exploring.
It's funny. It's after I wrote this, I felt a lot of pressure to keep writing experimental because it kind of goes back to what we were talking about earlier about having a brand. And then also, as somebody who does have attention deficit, writing experimental does not bore me and it constantly challenges me. But before that, I'd spent my whole life just writing, I won't say quiet Southern fiction, because again, a lot of my stories feel like they're in flames because they just move so quickly. But but just writing about just like typical Southern people. But right now I'm reading the Big Door Prize, which, yes, I have to admit, I'm reading a contemporary book after having watched the Apple television series and wanting to go back and read the, like popular fiction. But I think the author's name is M.O. Welsh. And it's funny because like if you watch the show, it could just be anywhere not South USA. And if you read the book, it's just plain old regular Southern fiction. And he has this Raymond Carver sort of way of, like here's 3 sentences with the emotional bomb. And you see that like in John Cheever and just the way that short stories kind of used to be. And, like I've spent the last 3 years of my life saying these are crazy times. How can you write normal stuff? Like you look at like where Dolly and other artists got their art, and you'd ask them and they'd say, well, the times are crazy. It's our job to pick the times. We have to paint crazy, and here I am kind of moving back into traditional literature. But reading that book, he just has so many, it's just like they're doing this, they're doing that. And then all of a sudden there's just like some normal sentence. And I feel kind of bad that I can't think of an exact example, but like maybe the wife is chopping tomatoes and it's the same regularity with which she always chopped. And that's how she knew her marriage was okay.
Mm.
Like it's something like that. And like, okay, great. And it goes back to just my personal preference to not have emotion outpouring. Like on some level, I might as well even be British, but it's like, I really don't care what you ate last night. I mean, I don't know. But he just has a lot of things like that in there, and it's the way that I used to write.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm seeing how well that style of writing can look when it's been, because this novel's also been edited well. Like you can tell that he's gone back and done several versions, maybe not writing from scratch, but it's just well edited. It reads smooth, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And I think that too is why some of my stuff felt like it was on fire, because like it was on fire and you're touching it and it burns you because it needs to be a little. But that's got me kind of thinking, maybe I dismissed traditional literature a little too soon, and maybe there's more ways to kind of get inside of that, like an envelope, like an envelope can look flat and boring, but if you put cotton balls in it, it can become this rich, wide thing. Like it depends on what you put inside of it. And so I don't know, I kind of want to just like write something normal and see what happens.
I love that so much. And you've shared just in that answer, you've shared a couple of potential exercises for myself and any listeners to kind of dig into, look at the traditional, see if you can use that framework to kind of do something with it, or, try to look at what's popular and see if you can kind of weave your voice in there in some way. But lastly, the first part of it is, what is on the horizon for you in terms of publications and latest projects and things like that? And the second part of it would be, what is it that you're looking to improve in your craft? You've kind of done a little bit of this, but in more concise words, if you could.
In my craft, I want to get better, which sounds like the stock answer, except it's my real answer. And I think that if I could hone that down, like some people are like, well, I really want to concentrate on setting, on exploring flash as a medium or whatever. But I don't know. I just want to get better. And I think if I could hone that down, I would be better. But I do keep getting better. So we'll keep working on that. And then remind me what the first question was, because I do want to answer that.
What's on the horizon for publications or projects?
I've got a short story coming out in Ellery Queen Mystery Magazine in January. I'm actually going to hopefully start publishing with them more. I would say I've been writing a lot of crime short stories lately, but turns out I'm just writing. It goes back to like that kind of Southern fiction that I was writing before, and turns out that they classify as crime because parts of the South are just inherently violent.
Well, I think that about covers it for the time being. But Terena, I want to thank you so much for this lovely collection that you put together. I was just really taken with its scope and ambition to cover difficult topics and difficult conversations and try to provide a very human lens to view these things through. And I want to thank you for your honesty about what it's like to be a writer. I mean, it's incredibly challenging, but so rewarding. And for being a badass, I'm incredibly inspired. And I really hope that we get to chat again, because this was a blast.
Yeah, definitely, Jaime. I appreciate your time. Thank you.
All right. Well,
and thank you everybody listening at home or subway or work or wherever they are. So
That's right. Well, I hope you have a wonderful trip wherever you may be, and I'll be in touch real soon on the internet. Okay.
Thank you, Jaime. I'll talk to you later.
Take care.
All right.
Bye.